now we are coming to the second session of Maharana Pratap Annual Geopolitics Dialogue 2024. And Nina Slama, our India-Israel Affairs Coordinator and a lecturer at Reichman University, Israel. She is the moderator for this session. So over to you, Nina. Please introduce all the speakers. And I think Dr. Sriparna Pathak has to leave early because she has some other assignments. So please invite her, as either first or second, whichever way you prefer. In the meantime, we'll get her presentation running. Thank you.
Abhinav, just a question. Do we wait to Professor Kondapalli? I cannot see him here.
Professor, okay, I'll just call him. I'll call him.
Thank you. Yeah. So hello and welcome to the Maharana Pratap Geopolitics Dialogue. My name is Nina Slama. I'm from Reichman University, and it is a great pleasure to moderate this session on dissecting China's long-term geopolitical attempts and cartographic revisionism. I will first of all present our esteemed panelists, and I will invite them to share their remarks. So we have with us Dr. Sriparna Pathak. Dr. Sriparna Pathak is an associate professor and associate dean of admissions at the Jindal School of International Affairs, O.P.Jindal Global University, Haryana, India. She specializes in teaching courses on the foreign policy of China and theories of international relations. Her expertise lies in China's domestic economy, trade and economic relations between India and China's foreign policy and economic linkages worldwide. Dr. Pathak has also published a book titled Drifts and Dynamics, Russia's Ukraine Role and Northeast Asia. She is a senior fellow at Usanas Foundation. We have also the pleasure to have with us Dr. Sarah Masha Fianberg. Dr. Sarah Masha Fianberg is a senior researcher and head of the Great Powers Research Program at Tel Aviv University's Elrom Center for Air and Space Studies. She is a lecturer in the MA program for Security and Diplomacy Studies at Tel Aviv University and serves as an adjunct professor of Israeli affairs at Georgetown University. Dr. Fianberg contributed extensively to academic and policy spheres and is active in fostering Europe-Israel relations as a board member of ENNET. She is a distinguished fellow at Usanas Foundation. We had also the pleasure to have with us Professor Srikanth Kondapalli. Professor Srikanth Kondapalli is the Dean at School of International Studies, SIS, at Jawahar Nehru University, where he specializes in modern Chinese history. He has also had positions as an honorary fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies in Delhi and as a research associate at the Center for Chinese Studies at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa. He obtained his education in Chinese studies in both India and China. Professor Kondapalli has authored 3 books, 2 monographs, co-edited a volume, and contributed numerous articles to national and international journals and newspapers. He has presented research papers at conferences worldwide and served as a guest faculty member at various academic and defense institutions in India. We also have the pleasure to have with us Captain Carl Schuster. Captain USN Carl O. Schuster has 45 years of experience as a military operations planner and intelligence analyst. He transitioned to intelligence mid-career after serving on various US and Allied warships, with extensive planning experience from amphibious group to theater command levels. He culminated his career as the Director of Operations at the U.S. Pacific Command's Joint Intelligence Center, a prolific author with over 600 published articles and a sought-after subject matter expert for CNN International. Captain Schuster has been teaching at Hawaii Pacific University since 2000. We're also delighted to have with us Mr. Nathaniel Sher. Mr. Nathaniel Sher is a senior researcher analyst at Carnegie, China, focusing on China's foreign policy and U.S.-China relations. His work has been featured in Foreign Policy, Wired, The Wired China, Responsible Statecraft, and the Tsinghua University International Relations Review. He holds a BA in History from Oberlin College and an MA in International Relations from Tsinghua University, and the University of Chicago. So welcome to you all. It is a pleasure to have you here in this timely panel. And I would request now Dr. Sriparna Pathak to share her remarks. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Professor Nina Slama. It's always wonderful speaking to you. Thank you, Usanas and the Ministry of External Affairs for organizing the MPAGD. And I hope you grow from strength to strength. Thank you, Dr. Pandya. Thank you, Dr. Jain. Special thanks to you, Mehak and Preeti, because I've been troubling you all quite a lot. I'll be speaking today on cartographic challenges in the Indo-Pacific, and my focus would be on India. But before I get into India, last year on August 28th, China released the latest version of its standard maps, which showed several areas outside the country as parts of its territory. Now, this publication of this standard map led to concerns and protests by its neighbors like India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, and Vietnam. Now, this is not the first time that China has done this. China has a history of not abiding by the rule of law. Two recent examples include the rejection of the UNCLOS arbitration tribunal by China, showcasing a maritime jurisdiction delineation. The case was brought to the Hague Tribunal by the Philippines, and China completely rejected it and even questioned the rationale for the existence of the Hague Tribunal. The second example is China not moving back to its pre-2020 position on the borders with India, despite several bilateral agreements, despite several rounds of discussions on mutual de-escalation. I would like to speak on China's cartographic aggression against India. And for this, next slide, please. For this, I'm using screen grabs of simple open source searches on India in the world. Now, these are the results which you can see on the screen. There's geology.com, there's Adobe Stock, there's Britannica, there's Alamy, there's Dreamstime, and these are just some of the few names from this screen grab which show parts of Indian territory as China's. These are not even shown as disputed, but these are shown just as China's. Next slide, please. As China's territorial ambitions grow, its use of maps to stake claims is becoming increasingly provocative. So the question here is, what does China do? Why does it use cartographic aggression? This 2023 edition of the Standard Map of China, released by the Ministry of Natural Resources of the PRC, is neither the first one nor the last one to illegally document unilateral claims on the sovereign territories of other countries. It's not the last one, as I said. It's been published by design to documentarily justify its illegal claims by launching a cartographic offensive. It forms part of legal warfare, which is a component of the three warfare strategy. It's an attempt to produce legal justification of illegal claims. Now, the other part of this cartographic aggression is giving Chinese names to places in other countries where it extends its illegal claims. Although it's quite certain that such an act in isolation does not change anything on the ground, but the intention, timing, and strategy behind such repeated attacks or acts is worthy of an analysis. Next slide, please. Coming to the boundary dispute between India and China, China had never accepted India's demarcation lines of the border. In the western sector, British India's proposal of the Johnson-Ardagh line, which ran along the Kunlun range and kept Aksai Chin within Indian territory, was not acceptable to Imperial China. In the eastern sector, Republican China, ROC, rejected British India's McMahon line, which demarcates India's border with Tibet on the basis of the watershed principle. So clearly a lot of logic and principles have been used, but neither does China understand logic nor does it understand principles. Hence, this ambiguity thrown up by China became the norm of the India-China border, continues to remain so. Even after India became independent, China underwent a revolution. The differences over the border were such that a resolution appeared distant even during the heights of India-China friendship in the 1950s. In the 1950s, when then Prime Minister Jawahar Nehru had taken the maps and shown it to China, because India and China were brothers back then, and had shown it to Zhou Enlai and had said that, these are Indian territories which are shown within the PRC's territory. Zhou Enlai, in a very cavalier sort of way, said that, these are KMT and ROC maps and we've not had time to take a look at them. and India accepted that argument. Probably should not have done that. Now, it's in this historical setting that China's cartographic aggression against India has to be located. China has consistently pushed its version of the border on its maps, wherein both Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh are shown within China's borders. There's something else which China does. China calls Tibet Xizang, and in the most recent white papers on Tibet, it's been calling it Xizang, which means Western Treasure House. I'm transliterating. Now, a lot of media personnel, academics, and people across the globe and within India use the term Xizang. There's a strategic implication to this. The moment Xizang or Western Treasure House is called Xizang, Arunachal Pradesh becomes Nanzang or Southern Tibet. So there's a very strategic calculation to that, which has implications not just for Tibet but also for India. Next slide, please. China's cartographic aggression is not just limited to lines on the map, it extends to names. China has been on a renaming spree of what it considers to be its border areas, but which are located within Indian territory. It has renamed a total of 32 places in Arunachal Pradesh in the past few years, 6 in 2017, 15 in 2021, and 11 in 2023. These include geographical features and human settlements. Whether in the Western Pacific or in the Himalayan region, China establishes its own lines and labels on the map before reaching a negotiated settlement, and then it uses the duration of the negotiations to alter facts on the ground to match the pre-drawn lines. This sort of cartographic aggression matches China's expansionist policies by diminishing its gravity and imparting on it an appearance of normalcy. China seems to be trying to incrementally bolster its territorial claims. Cartography in this case is more of an instrument or a strategy for achieving the goal of territorial expansionism. At the same time, the domestic dimensions of such cartographic exercises also need to be kept in mind. What needs to be noted here is that China held a National Map Awareness Publicity Week upon the release of this so-called standard map, which is a regular practice during such releases. These instances convey a very important message to India. Even if there is a formal resolution on the border with China, which may at best be a temporary arrangement, the Chinese will discard it at their own convenience. They've done it in the past and they're going to do it again. Next slide, please. So India needs to be wary of this possibility while thinking long-term about its border with China. Military preparedness, infrastructure build-up, the facilitation and development of population settlements in border areas are essential, and the government is taking a few steps in this direction. There's a need for India to strengthen its own cartographic narrative. A cursory glance at images, some of which I showed you in the first slide, these images available on the internet reveals the dearth of maps that accurately depict India's borders. Even if these have to be shown as disputed, they need to be shown as disputed, not parceled off to China's territories. There's a need also to spread awareness amongst Indian citizens to always use the correct maps of the border areas to avoid those that undermine India's interests. India is not alone in facing China's cartographic challenge. It's imperative to make common ground with other aggrieved neighbors of China and to use maps and place names that are in solidarity with each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity, which provide a counter narrative to China's cartographic propaganda. Last year, in 2023, the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology of India and the Survey of India cracked down on apps hosted on app stores such as Google Play, which have been depicting India's maps incorrectly. Again, last year, the Survey of India, based on the information received from the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, sent a notice to Google stating that the app World Map Quiz, which is hosted on the Play Store, depicted the territories of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh incorrectly. The app, developed by Cubis Studio, had garnered over 5 million downloads on the Play Store. India's Information Technology Act and IT rules prohibit publishers of content from hosting any content that is illegal under any law in any jurisdiction. The notice was sent under Section 79(3)(b) of the IT Act, which said that the incorrect depiction of India's boundary jeopardizes the sovereignty and integrity of India. The Survey of India also informed Google that depicting an incorrect map of India is an offense under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1990. Despite this, there is a scant awareness even in India regarding the laws around incorrect usage of maps. Something which Philippines of late has been doing is worthy emulation. Of late, Philippines and embassies of Philippines across the globe have been showing the correct map of Philippines and have been historically also showing, they've been also using a lot of historical maps to showcase as to how the disputed territory was always Philippines and China has no locus standi. The logic behind it is that China has this concept of meimianzi, or loss of face. And that is a very powerful driver of Chinese foreign policy as well. So what Philippines tries to do is to incur reputational damages on China, as well as to showcase the correct maps. So I think India could also take a leaf from that particular experience. And with this, I'll just come to the end of my presentation. Thank you for being so patient.
Thank you, Dr. Pathak, for outlining so brightly and so greatly the matter. We have one question because I know that you have to leave soon. From Manda, who is asking, what is India doing in terms of promoting rather non-traditional, non-bureaucratic people-to-people diplomacy? Thank you.
I'm assuming the question is, in terms of people-to-people diplomacy with China, with the PRC.
Yes.
Okay. So, after 2020, when China unilaterally attacked us at Galwan, there have been a host of changes because it just proved to India that cooperation is not working. Now, China has disputes with 14 countries in the world, land boundaries and maritime boundaries, land boundaries with India and Bhutan. Bhutan doesn't even recognize the PRC. But over the years, no other country in the world has been attacked as many times as India has been. 62, 67, 87, Doklam, Galwan, Yangtze Valley crash, we have it all. This has happened again and again. I'll just give you an instance of how India tried cooperation again, even after 2020. When the Western world was, not sending its delegations to the Beijing Olympics, India should have also probably done that, but not because of human rights concerns, but because we were in an active conflict with China. But then, as has been Indian tradition, we did send a delegation to extend a hand of friendship. How did China repay us? The mascot of Beijing Olympics was Chief Apao, who in all open sources videos can be seen martyring our soldiers at Galwan. People to people ties, of course, have taken a hit. We are living in the technology generation. So these sorts of videos, completely throw that rosy notion of cooperation out of the window. China has been trying to placate India because it needs India's market. If you just look at last year and the number of commentaries which have been published by Masha, their highest diplomat in India. We don't have a Chinese ambassador to India at the moment. She's published at least 10 to 15 such editorials saying that India and China are friends, just to placate. So it's very clear to India that China wants India as a partner, but as a subordinate partner in its whole war with the West. So people to people contacts also have taken a hit. The reason as to why I speak, read, and write Chinese is because of a joint fellowship between India and China. It does not exist anymore. We are actually, increasing our people-to-people ties with Taiwan because, learning Chinese language and cooperation in this sector is important. So, people-to-people ties have taken a hit. China has weaponized visas against Indians, and India has also responded in the same way. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Pathak. It was a pleasure to hear you. We turn now to my friend, Dr. Sarah Masha Fianberg, who will share her thoughts in the matter. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for the privilege of speaking at the Maharana Pratap Annual Geopolitics Dialogue of 2024. In the 10 minutes or so, I would like to present a research that we conducted in Israel about the emerging presence of China in the Middle East and its implications for the air domain. And it's important for me to present this research because during our reflections, our thinking, we had 3 amazing dialogues with our Indian colleagues from the Usanas Foundation, with the Chinese experts and Middle East experts who generously shared their views, and this dialogue helped us better shape our research. So basically, I would like to take a strictly Israeli perspective and raise two concerns regarding China's expanding presence in the Middle East and in North Africa. The first concern is related to the transfer of dual-use technology in areas that are key to 21st century warfare. And the second concern is the actual or the potential transfer of arms and sophisticated weapons, including military drones, fighter jets, and satellites, to key actors in the Middle East. I have to say that when we are taking this perspective on what China is doing at the operational level, we leave open the possibilities of China's expansion at the strategic level. What I mean by that, in the Middle East, you have two main narratives regarding China's intentions. One of them is an alarmist narrative describing China as interested in dislodging the United States from the area. And the second one is a moderate narrative that presents China's expanding presence, through the building of infrastructure and etc., as driven by economic and commercial interests. What I want to say is that regardless of China's intentions and strategic horizon in the Middle East, what I'm going to say will still be relevant to the air forces operating in the area, including the Israeli Air Force. Let me come back briefly to the first concern. First concern is the increasing transfer of dual-use technology in sectors that will shape the future battlefields, as we saw in the war in Ukraine, such as communication, quantum technology, cyber, space, and artificial intelligence. And of course, the whole issue for us, from an Israeli point of view, is the blurred nature of those technologies that can be used for civilian use or for military purposes. Regarding, for example, the transfer of communication technology, in 5 or 10 years from now, Air Force operating in the area should consider the possibility of Chinese communication technology being vastly introduced to the region, increasing the threat of air-to-air or surface-to-air missiles functioning within a network of detection and launch systems. Regarding space, there should be increased attention to the Chinese providing intelligence and satellite services, particularly, the famous Beidou navigation satellite system in the MENA region. Those services, as we know, includes Earth observation, communication, connectivity, positioning capabilities, and even, which is a concern, which could be a concern for the air forces operating in the area, missile launch alerts. I have to say that Iran is the only country with Pakistan that acquired the Beidou 2 system, the second generation Beidou navigation system, which could serve as a force multiplier for Iranian systems as a whole. Let me now briefly relate to the second concern, which is the transfer of sophisticated weapons in MENA, or weapons that could be mobilize military resources from the air forces in the area. Let me come back to this. If we look at the transfer of China's weapons to the area, now it's peanuts. It's very negligible, it's low in quality, very low in quantity, even though it has increased dramatically in the past years, but it is still very low. What is the concern is that China is related to the modus operandi of China. What I mean by that, I mean that China is willing not only to transfer the technology, for example, the drone technology, but also the technology production capability. I'll give you an example. In March 2022, China and Saudi Arabia created a joint venture, the Aerial Solutions, to collaboratively design and manufacture military drones in the kingdom, including wireless detection systems and radar and communication systems. So this Chinese joint venture approach, providing the military know-how and the production capability, could enable its clients to initiate their own weapon systems and programs in the future. Also, China's willingness to allow its partners to achieve self-production could significantly empower previously non-threatening actors. So from this point of view, the main dimension of China's military transfers at the moment is the UAVs. China has acquired, a leading position in the transfer and export of UAVs across the Middle East, especially due to the fact that the United States has refused to transfer those technology to its allies and partners, but also, of course, to our enemies. And what is of concern is a dual sword. First of all, a quantitative concern. If we were to see an exponential increase of Chinese UAVs circulating in the Middle East, that would consume resources and attention that should be otherwise deployed by the air forces in the area. In other words, air forces in the area might have to dedicate too much attention to the UAV problem at the expense of other issues in the area. The second one is qualitative, because China is increasingly transferring advanced capabilities in terms of UAVs that are integrated with AI technology, which can be used as force multipliers. So in addition to complete UAV systems, China can transfer UAV integrated technological capabilities and production capabilities to regional actors, which might also greatly strengthen the offensive capabilities of certain actors in the area. The last point is the potential introduction into MENA of advanced Chinese-produced or co-produced weapons, such as long-range, active or semi-active radar homing seeker surface-to-air missiles, including air defense against medium-range ballistic missiles and new generation aircraft with improved performance and new air-to-air capabilities. So as a conclusion, China's military presence and transfer of technology and military capabilities at the moment has a very low impact on MENA's security architecture. But if we take a midterm or long-term perspective, there is an increased risk of Chinese expanding presence and expanding transfers and transfers of know-how to key regional actors in the area that could potentially impact negatively the freedom of action of the air forces operating in the area. To wrap up, I would like to say that even though China is an emerging and increasing threat, the main threat that we have at the moment from a big power perspective is of course coming from Russia, which is not an emerging threat as China, but is a deep-seated threat that has a deep and long-range impact on the region's security architecture and the freedom of action of the air forces operating in the area. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fianberg. I'm sure that we will return to you with questions. Now I would like to invite Captain Carl O. Schuster to share his thoughts and remarks. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you all, first of all, for this very kind invitation to participate. As discussed earlier, the latest China standard map provides its claims of today, but I'm certain that a new map with expanded borders will surface in the near future. For example, in February of 2017, an example of China's flexible view and changing view of history, China's foreign ministry issued a statement saying the Taiwan Strait was international waters. Yet, shortly after passing its maritime law of the sea in 2023, the same ministry stated the Taiwan Strait had always been Chinese territorial waters. Clearly, they didn't expect anyone to remember the statement from 6 years earlier. Interesting that law and China's subsequent Coast Guard regulations awarded China the right to enforce its laws in its territorial and jurisdictional waters. Neither was defined geographically, suggesting that those boundaries will appear gradually over the next 20 years. It's a pattern we've seen almost continuously over the last 40 years. But there are two common themes. China only takes what it can get away with, and its academics always find irrefutable evidence that the claimed territory was always part of China. Nonetheless, China can behave reasonably when it must. After the Soviet Union's fall, Beijing moderated its long-standing claims to the newly independent Central Asian countries' territories, and it made some reasonable compromises in settling those disputes. However, that had more to do with Beijing's reluctance to face Islamic militancy than any desire to be a responsible regional player. After all, it founded the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to counter the rising Islamic militancy in those countries, all of which bordered China's Xinjiang province, where a restive Turkic independent movement was rising in the 1990s. The need for goodwill and the new government's cooperation against a common foe drove Beijing's responsible behavior in that instance. That also explains China's reasonable settlement of its border dispute with Pakistan. No such common threat is forcing China to moderate its behavior elsewhere, as India, Bhutan, and Nepal well know. For example, China began to violate its 1998 border agreement with Bhutan almost immediately upon signing that agreement and assuring the latter that Beijing respected its sovereignty and territorial integrity. But it built settlements on Bhutan territory outside the area that Bhutan and China had agreed on was Chinese. Beijing announced in 2002 that it had discovered irrefutable evidence proving its ownership of the now stolen lands and pushed for another interim agreement. Since then, Beijing has occupied about 5% of Bhutan's territory. It's built villages, settlements for villages, and the PLA has built troop encampments, all the while negotiating yet another border agreement with Bhutan, ostensibly in good faith. Moreover, China assaulted India in 1962 after promising to respect the border, seizing the eastern half of Aksai Chin. India held on to the western half, which China still claims. However, in the new standard map, you'll see that it claims that territory as Chinese and much of Arunachal Pradesh. Beijing justifies its claims on the unfair treaties between Britain and the Qing dynasty. What is interesting is that Chinese leaders ignore the unfair treaties the Qing imposed on the people of Tibet and the one-time Turkic kingdoms of what is now Xinjiang province and, of course, the Central Asian countries. Beijing's view of history is that its conquests, or those of its previous dynasties, were fair, and any territory subsequently lost were via unfair means. That leads to a natural question as posed by this session. What are Beijing's future intentions? The problem is that whenever Beijing wants a territory, it claims it has always been a part of China, dating back to ancient times. Yet, Tibet's inclusion in China is actually a very recent historical development. That once independent country has spent most of the last 2,000 years as a separate kingdom, opposing Han Chinese dynasties. The Qing dynasty conquered Tibet in 1758 and held it until the dynasty fell in 1911. Tibet then enjoyed 40 years of independence before its conquest by the PRC in 1951. It has been a subjugated province ever since, with nearly 1 million of its people held in concentration camps. So much for the land having always been Chinese. Similarly, China now claims the mountain plateau of Arundel Pradesh, claiming it is South Tibet. China has on more than one occasion agreed to respect the line of actual control that serves effectively as the Sino-Indian border. Yet, on several occasions, PLA troops have assaulted Indian soldiers patrolling the area, who fortunately repelled their attackers. Nonetheless, China is presently reinforcing its forces opposite the line of control and initiated significant road, rail, military facility, and airfield construction programs in that region. Beijing has reissued its assurances that it respects India's sovereignty and the line of actual control. And it has, of course, resumed coordination talks, something that authoritarian regimes always do when they've been repulsed. Russia has also fallen victim to China's constantly changing, illusory border agreements. China's new 2023 standard map incorporates all of Bolshoi Island, despite the 2008 Sino-Russian border agreement dividing the island equally between the two countries. More recently, Beijing academics have resurfaced the Qing dynasty's claims over much of Russian Siberia, including Vladivostok. No Communist Party leader has yet claimed to have irrefutable proof that Siberia has always been a part of China, but I expect it to do so if Russia's economic and military power ever declines. Beijing has expanded its maritime claims as well. Although Beijing publicly claimed the 9-dash line from its foundation, it did not pursue those claims violently during the 50s and 60s. That changed in 1974 when Beijing seized the southern Paracel Islands from South Vietnam, and then later captured 3 of United Vietnam's islands in the South China Sea in the 1980s. Additionally, within 2 years of the U.S. withdrawal from the Philippines, PLA forces occupied 4 Philippine reefs in the eastern South China Sea. Beijing also tried to seize Scarborough Shoal in 2011, but they were blocked by the Philippine Navy. However, China's maritime militia and Coast Guard continue to deny Philippine fishermen and forces from accessing the shoal or the waters around it, so it's stalemated. However, the UN Court of Arbitration subsequently ruled in 2016 that the seized islets and the waters around them belong to the Philippines, a judgment China has rejected. The history China uses to justify its actions are based on the fiction that the islands and waters of the South China Sea have always been part of China. In fact, their academics claimed just this week that the South China Sea was discovered by the Chinese in ancient times, as if those living on the beaches of that sea simply stared at it while on vacation. In fact, there is no history of Chinese occupation of any of those islands, other than a temporary presence by Kaxinga, a Ming rebel and pirate who preyed on Spanish and European shipping plying those waters in the 1660s and 70s. When the Manchus finally defeated Kaxinga's successors in the 1680s, they made no effort to occupy the South China Sea islands. So far, China's bullying in the South China Sea has been limited to the Philippines and Vietnam, but it persists in its claims to the entire sea. Beijing recently extended those claims to include Indonesia's Natuna Sea, which is outside the 9-dash line, and the waters off Malaysia and Borneo. Its maritime militia and Coast Guard, however, withdrew when confronted, but the incursions continue. Then there is the East China Sea, where Beijing expressed no interest to Japan's Senkaku Islands until there were reports of oil reserves there, and the U.S. transferred the Ryukyus, including those islands, to Japan in 1972. Within 3 years, China claimed those uninhabited islands have always been a part of China and has escalated its maritime militia and Coast Guard presence there ever since. and China's claims may soon expand. Chinese academics now claim the former kingdom of Okinawa, which once governed the Ryukyus, has always been a part of China. Beijing's foreign ministry refuted the statement in 2005, but has remained silent as it surfaces periodically in PRC academic circles and journals. If I may issue a warning, anytime Beijing wants to claim a territory, its academic community suddenly discovers evidence that the claimed area has always been a part of China. What's next? Well, those who think China has accepted their borders need to consider the case of Bhutan and Russia. If Beijing wants to seize new territory and believes it can get away with it, it will declare any existing agreement to be interim in nature and require renegotiations based on new evidence. To prevent this, China's neighbors must do two things. First, maintain a key eye on their borders and publicize with imagery and video, social media of any Chinese activity on their territory. Secondly, they should unite together and seek partnerships for common defense. So far, China only acts when it can get away with it. Its bullying against the Philippines has been exposed, and in that exposure has felt constrained and deterred. Beijing hasn't given up on bullying the Philippines, but it has had to back off and recalculate its actions several times. Its tactics may change, but the overall goal remains the same: adjust its history and violate its promises as required to gain more territory and resources at its neighbor's expense. Barring your questions, that concludes my presentation, if you will. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Capt. Schuster. I'm sure that we will return to you in the end of the session with questions. I would like to invite now Mr. Nathaniel Sher to share his thoughts and remarks on the matter. Over to you, sir.
Great. Thank you very much, Nina. And thank you to the Usanas Foundation for having me, as well as the esteemed colleagues joining this panel. I particularly applaud Captain Schuster for staying up till 2 a.m. in Hawaii, I believe. Kudos to you. So given today's theme of China's long-term geopolitical intent, I'd like to take a broader perspective to speak about the United States shifting perceptions of China's grand strategy, particularly in the pre and post-COVID-19 eras. I believe there have been important shifts in U.S. perceptions of China's capabilities, in particular, to fundamentally reshape the international order in recent years. Although the U.S. still perceives China as the greatest long-term challenge to the international order, U.S. assessments of China's capabilities to fundamentally reshape the order have changed. This reassessment has primarily taken place, I believe, due to, first, China's slowing economy. China's facing oversupply and declining prices in the real estate sector, high levels of local government debt, declining foreign direct investment, and long-term demographic challenges. Second, growing opposition to China's actions among U.S. allies and partners in the Indo-Pacific. As Sriparna mentioned, this includes India's willingness to defend its sovereignty claims in the Ladakh and Arunachal Pradesh, as well as the Philippines and the South China Sea, as Captain Schuster mentioned, as well as growing convergence generally among U.S. allies and partners in the region: Japan, Australia, ROK, etc. Finally, there's emerging evidence of persistent corruption and high-level purges among the Chinese leadership on the State Council, as well as in the People's Liberation Army. And these three factors primarily account, I believe, for changing perceptions in the U.S. of China's capabilities. When the Biden administration entered office in 2021, there was a bipartisan consensus that China sought not only to displace the U.S. in Asia to become an unrivaled regional hegemon, but also to seek to become a global superpower with preponderant military, economic, technology capabilities, as well as political influence around the globe. This view was typified by Rush Doshi's book, The Long Game. Doshi, of course, went on to serve as Senior Director for China on the National Security Council. And in 2021, he wrote, China is launching a strategy of displacement, one that extends efforts worldwide to displace the US as the global leader. Now, contrast this with the most recent U.S. annual threat assessment report released just 2 weeks ago, and I quote, China faces myriad and in some cases growing domestic and international challenges that will probably hinder CCP leaders' ambitions. In 2021, Rush Doshi's view was not entirely unreasonable. China's prospects in the early COVID-19 period looked promising. Early on, Beijing was able to contain the pandemic with its Dongtai Qingling Zhengci, its zero COVID policy, keeping case counts low and factories open. This led in 2021 to China being the fastest growing major economy with over 8% growth. Meanwhile, the US was experiencing political polarization typified by the January 6th incursion on the Capitol. The US economy was in a state of disrepair. The Trump administration had taken a series of actions in preceding years that had somewhat alienated US partners in Europe and East Asia. But in the last 3+ years, each of these variables has begun to reverse. China eventually became a victim of its success in containing COVID, remaining locked down for too long as economies around the world reopened. Its unwillingness to import foreign vaccines contributed to this series of events. And the lockdowns left lasting damage on China's business and consumer sentiment, leading to a weak economic recovery. At the same time, China's growth model that had propelled it to become the second largest economy in the world is showing signs of faltering. No longer able to rely on top-down investments in the fixed property and infrastructure sectors, the government is looking for new sources of growth, specifically in science and technology. But given the predominance of real estate, indirectly and directly accounting for nearly 30% of China's GDP, new areas of growth will be unable to fully offset declines in the property sector. At the same time, the US economy recovered quite well from the pandemic and is now nearly $10 trillion larger than China's in nominal terms, the largest gap since 2010. The US has repaired some of its relationships with allies and partners, upgrading the Quad to an executive level grouping, revitalizing trilateral cooperation with South Korea and Japan, inaugurating AUKUS with the UK and Australia, and recently or last year securing access to 4 bases in the Philippines under the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. All of this said, China will undoubtedly remain a destabilizing actor for years, if not decades to come, particularly with respect to its revisionist regional ambitions. However, under growing resource constraints, Beijing will have to focus its energy on a narrower set of objectives. These primarily including protecting regime security, defending its sovereignty claims, promoting unification with Taiwan, and protecting its developmental interests. What this means is that the China challenge no longer appears to be omnipresent or necessarily global, seeking to displace the United States everywhere all at once. Beijing will have to prioritize its ends and means, and for the U.S., this means that its response to China must be equally targeted, in particular to the areas deemed most destabilizing to the international order. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sher. So now I'll request the audience to ask questions to our distinguished panelists. Before that, I will ask one question to all our panelists. We discussed about different challenges that China poses to the world order, to regional considerations, border issues, and so on. And I would like to know whether China's aspirations and challenges could be addressed, in your opinion, on the bilateral level or multilateral or minilateral levels, and who or which countries or organizations can contain or address the challenges that China poses today. Thank you. So we can start with Dr. Fianberg.
I'm not a specialist of China, but the only point that I can make is that the latest or the current war between Hamas and Israel exemplifies the challenges and the limits of China's political and diplomatic expansion in our area. At the declarative level, China took a very, very aggressive stance against Israel by unilaterally sidelining with the Palestinians, and most importantly, refusing to condemn the crime against humanity that was perpetrated on October 7th, and by launching a massive campaign with anti-Semitic undertones on TikTok, in social media, especially in Taiwan and in other areas of the world. But this being said, Professor Slama, China has had a limited involvement in MENA, not really followed with deeds. The only change that we could, or maybe it's not a change, it's an accent that was adopted, was China's increased involvement in the security of the Red Sea, the navigation security of the Red Sea, with China basically taking a protecting role to safeguard the freedom of navigation of Russian and of Chinese navals, vessels, and of vessels that were identified with China. So we see this sort of complex and tense presence with, on the one side, a non-traditional, one-sided position when it comes to the Hamas-Israel conflict, and on the other side, a very, very limited and cautious deployment of its activities across the region.
Thank you, Dr. Fianberg. Now we turn to Captain Schuster to share his thoughts about this question.
I think China's involvement beyond Asia, China wants to be seen as a positive player, but they're not really willing to intervene except in very narrow circumstances that favor China. For example, they're ostensibly protecting Russian and Chinese vessels in the Red Sea, but in fact, the Al-Houthi have only attacked a Chinese-connected vessel once, and most analysts believe that was by error. They seem to have the targeting information to go after British-owned, American-owned, and European-owned vessels. So China's gesture is empty. They're protecting ships that aren't being attacked. They are very good at the anti-piracy mission, and they do seem to be committed to that. But when you deal with China in a positive way, it's more image than reality. China has provided the technology to Iran, and Iran has provided that technology to Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Al-Houthi. So China is, to an extent, a hidden hand. Their influence, I think, is much less than many people suspect or claim, but China is a player. China is also at least an economic supporter of what Russia is doing. They've offered to help with the peace deal in Ukraine, but the only deal that they've given any lip service to is the Russian agreement, their proposal, that Ukraine surrender all the territories it lost in 2014. So if you go outside of Asia, China is in areas where it claims to be making a diplomatic effort. There's not a lot of movement there. However, where China uses its economic clout, it's doing very well. It has gained significant influence in the Southwest Pacific by the simple provision of economic trade and aid in those very small countries. And it's done the same thing in the Caribbean and in Latin America. For example, China is now Peru's #1 major export market. But at the same time, Chinese fishing vessels have shown up in large numbers fishing illegally in Peruvian waters. China has made major inroads in Africa with their aid and trade. So their influence is growing on an economic political level, but they have been reluctant to do more than a one-sided approach to any kind of decision-making or actions. So the effort is there. I'm one who thinks the Chinese are taking a long-term view, and if I may steal the words of the previous speaker there, they're prioritizing, and I think they have to. No country can do all at once, everywhere, all at once. And so China, I think, has learned that lesson. Xi thought he could do it all at once, and now he's learned he can't. So I think the next 20 years are going to be interesting, and the next 5 years are going to be particularly so, but primarily in Asia.
Thank you, Captain Schuster. Mr. Sher, would you like to add something?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Nina. On this question of how to respond to China, whether bilaterally, multilaterally, or potentially minilaterally, I do think each specific issue set may require a different approach, but in general, the more countries working together, the more leverage they'll have. There is a risk, however, of assembling too many countries in a large multilateral organization and suffering from perhaps a collective action problem where there may not be complete alignment between the various countries involved. So for this reason, I do think the minilateral approach is generally more effective. This has been the approach in recent years of the U.S. with its various new coalitions, the Quad included, as well as AUKUS, IPEF, the list goes on. I think the problem we have in international institutions like the UN, WTO, etc., where you could have multilateral action, is China, as Captain Schuster mentioned, has been quite effective in building relationships through economic engagement and thereby actually gaining support from, in many cases, the majority of countries in the UN when it comes to votes on things like China's human rights and otherwise. So the multilateral approach often has downsides simply due to the fact that there isn't complete alignment between all of the actors. So yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mr. Sher. I would like to invite now Dr. Abhinav Pandya to ask his question.
Thank you. Well, as I guess I'll go back to Dr. Pathak's presentation. She mentioned a lot about China's obsession and love with cartography and the complex Chinese nature. But I have a very, very simple question. I would like to know something more about the China-Russia relations. It's very strange. They had their own border fights with them. Now they are fighting for the turf, like in the Central Asian region. Russia has its own insecurities. Russia sees the world as a multipolar world order in which Western civilization is one of the poles, and Russia has a vision of the multipolar world order. China may be bipolar or unipolar, in which only the Chinese. So what is the nature of the China-Russia relationship in the long run, and what can possibly happen in the long run? And secondly, a question related to this. By the Ukraine war, I mean, do you think that the Americans have really offered Russia on the platter to China? And is it a sound geopolitical strategy to let your enemies unite? Sorry if I'm being too blunt.
There are advantages to bluntness. They tend to focus thoughts. If I may, I'll take the first stab at that.
Please, sure.
If I may. I think the Russian-Chinese alliance, if you will, is tactical in nature. They don't trust each other. They have conflicting views on not only territory, but in a wide variety of areas of influence. Russia is very closely tied to Vietnam. It sees Vietnam as its window to Asia. It also is very worried about China's intentions towards Siberia and the Russian border areas in there. But China is necessary. They're necessary for each other in uniting against what they see as an oppressive Western dominance of international affairs. Russia needs China's economic help. They need Chinese wealth to set up an alternate system to the US-dominated banking system, which they have to use. They have to have a new system, BRICS, if you will. China facilitates Russia's evading banking sanctions and so forth. Having said that, however, I think that Russia knows, or Russian leaders know, that if they decline significantly, China's views on a wide variety of things of interest to Russia could change against Russian interest, which brings up, I think, the question you raised very well, is American policy towards Russia. It's gone through quite a transformation since I was on active duty. When Putin was first elected, we saw Putin as a breath of fresh air who was going to bring order out of chaos. He was going to strengthen the Russian economy, and he was very cooperative in the West his first 5 to 10 years. His speeches, however, gave an indication of where he might be going, although he did give a very interesting speech where he said Russia is, after all, a European country, and cooperation with Europe is vital to Russian interests. Somehow he abandoned that after 2005. The problem with the United States foreign policy, in my view, and mine is a personal view, is we don't think of alternatives. We think person A is a bad guy, and that person's removal will lead to nirvana in the area where that guy is in charge. That hasn't worked in Iraq, hasn't worked in Iran, and it won't work in Russia. We don't think of the alternative. What is worse than the current situation? We don't think that far. We just think the current situation is bad. Let's change it. Forcing Russia into China's hands, from a geopolitical perspective, is unwise. But from a domestic political perspective, it was smart policy. There are constituencies in the United States that don't trust Russia, that don't trust Putin. There are constituencies in the United States that think we should defend democracy at all costs, everywhere, all at once. And so our foreign policy becomes a compromise of all those conflicting factors. Many of the last 3 administrations wanted Ukraine to join NATO. And we had a Secretary of State in the 90s who felt the Russians are inherently evil. And therefore, we should put our foot on Russia's neck and keep it there until the Russians learn how to behave. And she made those statements publicly in international forums. And then we're shocked that the Russians decided maybe we perceived them as an enemy, and therefore we were their enemy. I don't know how to get past that, but I do think we're stuck with the current alliance between the two. What we've got to do is find a way to awaken some element of the Russian leadership to the fact that they are selling Russia's long-term interest for a short-term political problem. But I don't know how to do that. I'll turn that over to perhaps wiser heads than mine.
I'm certainly not a wiser head, but regarding the China-Russian relation, I think that the key term here is force multiplier. China is a force multiplier for Russia, economically, militarily, most importantly, and Russia is a force multiplier for China in terms of diplomatic assistance and reshaping a world order that is convenient for China. Something that is gone unseen, but basically Russia has almost accepted the fact that China has expanded its leverage across Central Asia. Russia is giving the keys of Central Asia to China, economically, almost demographically, in terms of foreign workers, in exchange for China's continuous enabling Russia of avoiding sanctions and engaging in its huge military buildup that Russia is doing at the moment. Also, we have to take in parallel, the main parallel to be conducted is between Ukraine and Taiwan. Ukraine is an enabler of the invasion of Taiwan, both in terms of collective awareness. One second, sorry. Both in terms of the collective possibility, the collective acceptance of Taiwan being invaded, and in terms of reshaping the rules of the game, especially if Russia becomes triumphant in Ukraine, because this war is increasingly being lost to my great, great regret by the West. Regarding the soundness of not of the United States policy, I speak as an Israeli, not as an American. I believe the United States has had a very courageous and a very systematic and thought through policy vis-à-vis Ukraine and China at the same time. China and Russia were aligned before the war in Ukraine, and there was nothing to be done about this. There is an increasing nexus between China, Russia, Iran, and the enemies of the free world. And so basically, the United States has courageously fought the two evils in the war in Ukraine by helping militarily assisting the Ukrainians and continuing to lead the military technological race against China. And I believe that this dual and calibrated policy was the right one and should continue. If the United States under a new administration were to abandon Ukraine, that would be a catastrophe in terms of China-Russia relations and in terms of their connection, reshaping the global security architecture. Thank you.
Dr. Pathak, I think you wanted to make
Yes,
a point.
I wanted to take a jibe at the China-Russia relationship, and I'll just mention three things. One is the Sino-Russian relations in the realm of energy commitments. One is Russia's provision of a lot of arms to China's enemy, Vietnam. And the third is Russia's fears of a demographic and a linguistic change in the Siberian East. Even if we go back to, say, at least 10 years ago, the Russian gas giant Gazprom had inked a $400 billion deal with China in 2014 to transport gas from Russia's east to its southern neighbor. It's not been fulfilled. It's not completed yet. The Kremlin had plans for a Siberian gas pipeline, which could access Chinese markets and make Russia less reliant on consumers in Europe. Again, not finished. No one knows what the status is. Both these gas deals have been slow to advance due to a lack of financing and enthusiasm from Beijing. There's been no progress on the Western Altai pipeline, which planned to link Russia to Xinjiang, which was promised by Li Keqiang during his visit to Moscow in November 2014. So economic ties have been stagnating. Russia had hoped that China would be a great help in boosting its economy. That really has not happened. Border was demarcated and demilitarized, but then, as we see in that China standard map, even that has been questioned by China. So what exactly is the basis of this no limits partnership is quite interesting to explore. If you go back even to 2015, Chinese direct investment in Russia fell by 25%, and it has only been falling. Again, after this no limits friendship that China and Russia talked about, there was an array of agreements which were talked about, signed about. No one really knows where they are going. Russia does not like China being in its backyard, the backyard of the Soviet Union, or the Central Asian countries. And China has made a lot of investments and a lot of outreach to Central Asian countries, not to the pleasure of Russia. Then there are huge Russian concerns of demographic influx from the Chinese border. Even before the onset of the economic crisis in 2008, some Chinese regions, particularly in the south and west, these were characterized by lagging economic development, surplus population, continuing unemployment. So there's been a lot of labor migration from China to Russia, and Russia hoped that there would be enormous benefits to China. The Chinese provinces which are closest to the Russian borders are Liaoning, Jilin, and Heilongjiang. But there's been a huge Chinese demographic pressure on the Russian border. And Putin himself had stated during a visit to the border city, to one of the border cities in 2008, he said to the residents that if they do nothing to turn the economic tide of the region, their children will speak Chinese. So why has Russia been turned into a junior partner for China? They have just one common enemy, which is the West, and particularly the US. It's just a friendship based on just one common factor. Otherwise, there's not much which is binding these two. Russia has supplied arms to Vietnam. They provided state-of-the-art air defense systems to the NVA. They provided MiG-17, 21 fighter jets, trained pilots, etc. And clearly, Vietnam and China are not the best of friends, of course. So it's a very transactional relationship. As I say, often state that if heavens forbid, China would be able to emerge as the hegemon of the system, displacing the US. May heavens forbid, may that never happen. But if it does, Russia would not like that. So the basis for the friendship is just one factor, the common animosity towards the West. Otherwise, there's not much which binds these two. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Pathak. We'll ask the last question to Mr. Sher. You mentioned China is having a grand strategy to overtake US. How do you think technology-driven military modernization undertaken by China in recent years can help in this endeavor? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. In terms of PLA modernization, I think the most significant development in recent years has been the rapid expansion of China's nuclear forces. The U.S. Department of Defense estimates that China will have approximately 1,000 nuclear missiles by 2030. Obviously, China has the largest navy by tonnage, a very formidable intermediate range missile force, and most of their military power is directed at Taiwan for a potential forced unification scenario. Obviously, there are limits to the PLA's capabilities. They haven't fought a real war since 1979. There isn't much experience in joint force operations, although we've seen recent exercises in that regard. And in terms of PLA's technological development, there are obviously ambitions to develop intelligence-sized or digitized fighting force by 2027. I think the jury is still out on how successful this will be. Obviously, there's been a proliferation of UAVs, unmanned vehicles in the PLA, which seem quite formidable. But otherwise, it does look like China's ambitions in the realm of AI haven't necessarily borne fruit in the way that many were expecting just several years ago. I'll leave it there. Perhaps Captain Schuster has views on the PLA as well.
Well, thank you, sir. I think you've hit the nail largely on the head, although as a retired naval officer, of course, I focus on the naval aspects of it. One of the things that I have noticed is that although they are have not yet acquired a fully developed joint doctrine and fighting capability, we're looking at, as you noted, a rising capability in that. If you look at their prioritization, their first priority is what they call the near seas, which we call the first island chain. They want to dominate and control the waters of the first island chain, which is the South China and East China Seas. If they can control those waters and prevent intervention from outside those waters, then they believe they can conquer Taiwan. The anti-ship ballistic missiles, of which they have over 100, are designed to assist the PLA Air Force, which also has long-range missiles, in preventing an intervention force from going from what they call the far seas, we call the second island chain, and intervening in any conflict contrary to China's interests within China's near seas. They're focused on that probably through 2030. The thing I'm looking at is their aircraft carrier force. At the moment, they can't challenge us carrier for carrier. But if you look, they have built 3 carriers in the time it took us to build 1. And their carriers are getting better. I think the Type 4 will be ready for sea trials here this summer. I think that it will be operationally ready a year after that. More importantly is what the Type 5 will be. Here's the indicator to look for if I can be more efficient. If the minute they build a nuclear-powered carrier, should they choose that option, that tells you they're looking at a global naval force. Right now, everything they're doing in their Navy is indicative of a focus on the near war with a capability to make forays into the far war. And their ability to make forays into the far war should be of concern to India. They're looking at the ability to challenge India in the Indian Ocean, what we call the third island chain, they call the Western Far Seas. They're not ready yet, but they do feel the day is coming when they will be. And it won't be just naval units and aircraft. It will be a ballistic missile supporting element in there somewhere. So they're developing the doctrine to do that. We tend to think of here and now. They tend to think of a decade from now. So blend those two together, and I think you can talk about China's growing military capabilities. More importantly, the prestige and power that comes with that may also work to China's benefit in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank all our esteemed panelists to be here today and discuss about this timely and important issue. I would like also to thank the audience and the Usanas Foundation and the External Affairs Minister and all organizers of this important Maharana Pratap Annual Geopolitics Dialogue. I will now give the stage to Dr. Abhinav Pandya to the next session. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nina, for moderating this session, and my heartfelt thanks to all the esteemed panelists who joined for this excellent brainstorming session. Interesting questions, interesting discussions, interesting answers, and once again, thank you very much. And Dr. Schuster, I really like your, when you describe the way American foreign policy is, obsession with the good, the bad, and the ugly, and the evil, that's something very interesting, and needs more exploration from an IR point of view.